People often ask me what my favorite console is, and believe it or not, I can never give a definitive answer, despite the 64 actually being in my name. However, I feel confident in saying that the 6th generation of consoles is typically my favorite. Really only because of how many different experimental games there were at the time. So it wasn't uncommon to take a leap of faith on a game and end up becoming a huge fan. That's how a game like Siren, a game that's so incredibly under the radar, can still have such a following that can lead to 2 further installments of the series. Sorry if I'm being quiet.
Siren. Or Forbidden Siren. But I just say Siren. This is a game that I had seen multiple times on the shelf at GameStop back in high school, and it got my attention, but I never took the plunge. Mostly because I myself didn't have a PS2. My uncle did though, so I talked it over with him and coerced him to buy the game. I was kind of fucked up like that.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to A Game for Freddy. My name is Derik64, and I like lighting myself on fire. Fucking Fugazis. Fuck you, Joey.
It's plain as day it's a horror game when you look at the case. This was around the time movies like The Ring and The Grudge were at their peak in popularity, so seeing it at GameStop, it was hard to ignore. As for myself, also coming off the heels of Silent Hill 2, I wanted to see what the game was about. Let me get into the story. I've gotten comments that my reviews are pretty spoiler heavy, so I'll try to skimp on some of the more meaningful stuff of the game's narrative, unless otherwise specified. So the game takes place in a small mountain village in Japan called Hanuta. The game starts off with Kyoya Suda, one of the characters that you play as in the game, at around 9:30 in the morning, the day before the events of the game take place. He looks at his bike with frustration, leading one to believe that he's gotten a flat tire. Shortly after, he comes across a girl in the woods. She becomes aware of his presence and she flees. At almost midnight later that same day in the exact same spot, Kyoya sees a ritual taking place by a cult that derived from Hanuta. He gets noticed, however, and runs away. Right after this, he sees a flash of what seems to be him running from an outside perspective. This results in him seeming to have a painful reaction and stops running. After this, he's approached by a police officer that clearly has his own issues. The cop draws his gun on Kyoya, and this starts us off into the first level. So basically what's going on is Hanuta has fallen victim to the acts of a malevolent cult. Even though Hanuta is the origin of this cult, the game takes place only in Hanuta, and you see a handful of times that it's completely maritime, as opposed to being part of the greater Japan and being set in the mountains. Even though Hanuta itself is still in a mountainous region, its borders are met with vast red oceans. There are a fair amount of characters you play as in the overall timeline of Siren, some of which are native to the village of Hanuta, and the others are from elsewhere. During the ritual that Kyoya witnesses, at some point, this is what alters the reality of the time and space of the location of Hanuta and essentially traps all the main characters that you, the player, will take control of. For those that are familiar with Silent Hill, for all intents and purposes, it's pretty much the same thing. So here's a slight spoiler warning, but given the nature of the game, a lot of the game's mystique is preserved, so do with that what you will. Basically, the end goal for the game's antagonist is to revive the cult's respective god, the Tachi. I call him Data Shin. There's some archives you find in the game that suggest Data Shin is some kind of alien, but again, as I get into it, you'll see this game's story asks a lot of its player to interpret the information as they see fit. And the titular Siren, the actual name of the game, is supposed to be Data Shin calling out to the followers of the cult in Hanuta and control them via a type of hive mind. These people would submerge themselves into the red water to be converted into Shibito, which literally means corpse people, so essentially zombies. In turn, by doing this, the main antagonist's perverse vision of all loyal followers reaching paradise will be achieved.
So, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Did I ruin the story for you? Huh?
So the gameplay admittedly is something that could take some time for you to get used to, and is very much a product of its time. it teeters a little bit on tank controls. When you push up on the joystick, your character will move forward respective to the direction the character is facing. You can also steer the character as you'd expect, left and right, basically when the joystick is at the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock position respectively. However, when you push the joystick straight left or right, the character will pivot or basically turn in place. This can be a little annoying, admittedly, for first-time players not familiar with these types of controls, but all in all, it doesn't take very long to get used to, and it does become second nature quickly enough. Also, the camera is at most times positioned behind the character in a third-person perspective, so the game makes the controls more digestible this way as opposed to its contemporaries like Silent Hill or more so the original Resident Evil. That being said, the right control stick controls the camera, but you don't have full agency over it. It's really for more control over your peripheral sight, if that makes sense. Some players can make use of it, whether it's to make the game itself easier to play or to just simply augment the game's spooky atmosphere. So Siren is a survival horror stealth game. In my opinion, these elements are a match made in heaven. Stealth is integral to being able to traverse stages in the game, and as the game is a horror game, that's all the more anxious one can be from the fear of getting found or seen by the enemies in the game, henceforth contributing to the thrill. So in every stage there are Shibito, the main enemies of the game. Like I mentioned before, Shibito means corpse people, which suggests them to be zombies, but they're more complex than that. Shibito retains some human behavior such as performing hammering and boards for builds, being able to use firearms, or even just attacking with knives or hammers. However, these characteristics are very bare bones, so one can say the Shibito are more akin to robots than to zombies. There are other types of Shibito you encounter as you play as well. You have what the community refers to as the dog Shibito, where they run on all fours. They tend to do more damage than a regular melee Shibito and are much faster. However, the advantages end there, seeing as how they can't open doors unlike more humanoid Shibito. There are also spider-like Shibito. These are like the dog Shibito, except that they can climb on the walls and ceilings, but this is more dependent on the specific Shibito. If you come across one on the floor, it's going to stay on the floor. They do even more damage than the dog Shibito, but like the dog Shibito, also can't open doors. Beyond this, you have Shibito brains. Shibito brains are essentially the controlling being that is mentally tethered to all the Shibito in a given area, or basically throughout a stage. Like I mentioned before, this hive mind type of relationship the Shibito have is pretty much the reason why when there is a Shibito brain in the stage, the mission objective is often to quote-unquote drive away the Shibito brain, basically incapacitating it. That brings us to another interesting subject about the Shibito. Notice how I said incapacitate and not kill. That's because unlike zombies or even most other enemies in a given game, you can't indefinitely knock out a Shibito while you traverse the stage. Shibito can be knocked out fairly easily, however they will always revive after a certain amount of time. This can vary from enemy to enemy. Usually for basic Shibito they will be incaped for several minutes. However, this time frame can vary from one Shibito to another, so you can't be too sure how much time you can let your guard down given the situation. The dog Shibito, for instance, also can be down for several minutes, although typically not as long as humanoid Shibito. The spider Shibito, however, are usually within a span of 10 seconds from the time they go dark to the time they regain consciousness. Another type of Shibito is the flying Shibito. These Shibito are basically a Shibito whose head is morphed into a dragonfly. They fly around a stage quickly and use firearms to attack you. Shibito brains usually are the main objective to a given mission, however that isn't always the case. Shibito brains are usually identifiable by their extremely bizarre and grotesque head and face. Usually they can have a bunch of tentacles coming out of their heads, to what seem to be a bunch of barnacles on their face, to even one having multiple eyes. There's also rare cases where there's actually more than one brain Shibito per stage, and the mission objectives of these are usually to escape or something other than driving away the Shibito brain. Shibito brains are very resilient and can kill some characters in a single hit. Some won't even flinch or stagger when you hit them, making contending with them all the more nerve-wracking. When you do manage to escape these guys though, they'll go down only to almost immediately get right back up.
Dude, one of these guys gonna go away. What the fuck is that?
Hey,
No, not time yet.
So you have enemies that don't die, some that can sprint towards you, fly over you, shoot you, and a lot of times the character you play as doesn't even have a firearm or even a melee weapon at their disposal. So how are you supposed to contend with the elements of the game in play? Surely you aren't expected to be able to stealth your way through 90% of the game without fighting, right? Well, here's the biggest thing in the Siren series that separates it from the others. You have the ability to sightjack. Just how it sounds, sightjacking is the ability to enter a meditative state and tune into the Shibito's point of view. You do this by pressing L2 to bring up your sightjack mode. Once in this mode, you can steer the left joystick to tune into the perspective of one of the Shibito in a given area. The clarity of how well you can see via their perspective is dependent on how physically far they are from you, but for the most part, you can see perfectly fine. With the face buttons, you can quick map a perspective from up to 4 Shibito at a time, so you don't have to physically tune into their perspective every single time you enter sightjack mode. Another plus is that if you die during a stage, once you restart, you'll already have the pre-existing Shibito still mapped to your face buttons, saving you time and a headache of having to sightjack the enemies all over again. You don't just tune into the perspectives of the Shibito, you can tune into other human NPCs as well. There are a fair amount of instances where you have to do escort missions. These aren't as bad as they sound, but they can vary, and can be absolutely terrible at their worst.
This is exactly why I told you not to come.
Professor, we need to find the villagers. They must be panicking.
Please shut up.
You can sightjack your escort to find out where they are in relation to you, which can help you strategize a way to sneak past enemies. However, when witnessing the character you're in control of from the perspective of your escort, it is pretty suggestive. I thought this back when I played this game, around the time I was 16 or so, and you probably could have told me something along the lines of, "Damn boy, grow up. Get your head out of the gutter." As of the time of the writing for this video, I'm 31, and yeah, still same thoughts. Another thing that players could probably appreciate is being able to eavesdrop on conversations that NPCs are having amongst each other. This is actually very infrequent, but still, for those of you that would be interested, it does further some exposition to help with understanding the game's story to its fullest. Another thing to point out, and that I'm sure you've noticed by now, is the crosshairs on the screen. When you are sightjacking enemies, you will see colored crosshairs. A blue crosshair is the character that you're controlling at that point in time, and the green one can be an NPC that you may have with you or is just in the stage at all. This helps you determine your spatial awareness. This is important because a lot of times trying to determine where you are in relation to enemies on a new stage that you haven't seen before can be tough, and without the crosshairs it would be all the more difficult on a new level you're not familiar with. Last but not least is a red crosshair, which is actually seen from a regular gameplay perspective, not via sightjack. These are from Shibito that are aware of your location and are actively trying to pursue you. All of these crosshairs can be seen through solid objects and the like, so you don't need to have a direct line of sight to be able to see where these crosshairs are. So as you'd expect from a horror game like this, the combat is very bare bones, although maybe slightly more robust than Silent Hill 2's combat, respectively. In a lot of instances, you won't be able to fight due to not having a weapon, and this is dependent on the stage and character you're playing as. Some characters will have melee weapons such as a ratchet or crowbar. When it's needed, you can hold R1 to assume the attack position, and if there's a Shibito in the immediate area, the game will have you automatically lock onto it. Assuming there's more than one at a time, you can switch targets by pushing left, right, up, or down, depending on the respective direction of the other Shibito. With melee weapons, you have a light and heavy attack. The light attack is less damaging, but can be done quicker. Of course, on the flip side, the heavy attack does more damage, but takes longer to pull off. It's worth noting that the humanoid Shibito also do the same thing. They can do either heavy or light attacks of the same kind. I usually do heavy attacks only because you can time it well, and the Shibito will walk toward you despite you doing the wind-up for a swing. Also, you can do heavy attacks back to back, again if you time it right. You hit them, they stagger back, but will again walk towards you. You can catch enemies in this loop often, and as long as you find a rhyme and don't waver, you'll have no problem dispatching enemies this way. A light attack is done by pressing the X button in an instance, like a tap basically. A heavy attack is basically you laying your thumb on the button for longer than that. Since there are a few variations of Shibito you come across, you may have to adjust your fighting strategy accordingly. So using guns is a little different as you would expect. Sometimes you'll have a revolver and sometimes you'll have a rifle. The advantages, of course, is that since you have a firearm, you can attack enemies at a distance as well as do more damage relative to melee weapons. Of course, given that the game focused so much on stealth, the downside is that firearms do make a lot of noise and will attract other enemies. Another thing that emphasizes the stealth is that you can't just run through stages shooting everything down that comes your way. You do have limited ammo, and you can easily run out if you don't pick your fights. And of course, once you run out of ammo, you're then worse off than you would be with just a regular melee weapon. And you rarely ever have both, so this is something to be mindful of. When you have a revolver and draw your weapon on an enemy, it's a plus that you will lock onto the enemy and can still strafe about as opposed to being stuck to the one spot, kind of like an over-the-shoulder perspective. This actually goes for the melee weapons as well. However, it's a different story with the rifle. There's times where you have a rifle, a normal, simple rifle with no scope or attachments of any kind. However, it's a dedicated sniping weapon. When you aim, you use a scope. The rifle is very strong, and typically takes out the majority of enemies in one shot. It can be cumbersome to aim though, since the view snaps to this scoped perspective and gets rid of your peripheral vision. However, this is only an issue if and when you have Shibito in the immediate area. You can struggle to aim in a hurry with a Shibito only a few feet away. Another thing to address is that there are Shibito that have firearms of the same kind in stages. With the revolver, depending on distance, it can determine the accuracy of your shots, and in a hurry, shooting back to back will lower your accuracy. Even during nighttime, not using your flashlight will lower your accuracy. Of course, all these factors do make sense, but still I feel it should be mentioned all the same. Given the nature of the rifle, however, these factors don't really apply. So, there are a slew of characters in the game, and you play as all of them depending on the stage. The way the game works is that it has a type of chronological time frame that you play out of sequence called the Link Navigator. The game takes place in the span of 3 days, a total time frame of 72 hours. For me, this immediately harkens back to Majora's Mask. Basically, imagine if the Bomber's Notebook from Majora's Mask was a stage select, and then you'd have an idea of how the Link Navigator works. The Link Navigator shows you stages that have been unattempted in a light blue color, movie stages in a dark green, and stages that have been completed in a darker blue. Also, every stage has 2 missions to complete, so upon finishing the first mission, you will see the respective level have a divided segment of dark blue and light blue, indicating that the second mission still must be completed for said level. The Link Navigator doesn't get unlocked, however, until a fairly short time into the game. Second mission objectives are typically much harder than the first. The bright side though is that they usually involve doing a certain action as opposed to trying to escape and etc. So when it's a mission where you'd normally have an escort, a lot of times you could just leave them at the start where it's typically safest in order to go about the stage for the mission.
Musicality on the track.
The game setting is very Japanese. I like games like this, and for me it reminds me of the 6th generation of consoles quite a bit. Very quaint and uniform, but also for the horror aspect, very unnerving and very claustrophobic. You got a pretty good variation of settings here. You got a small business district near a river, you have a mountain village, there's a construction site, a rice paddy field, a fucking house, there's a hospital and a school, so there's a lot of places. These places where the stages take place also change given when they're visited in the respective timeline. Sometimes they're very minor changes like finding a magazine or a flyer or something of that nature and would go to your archives. Other times they can be very large changes, such as the Upper Arato, where the business district is where it's pretty normal, but by the end of the 3rd day has had all this build and scaffolding added, changing a lot of how the level is traversed. A player's first time through these stages can prove challenging, given one not knowing the layout. You actually have access to a map by pressing the select button though. I didn't know this despite this particular playthrough not being my first. Bad move on me too, considering it's actually in the manual. But oh well. The map is also very simple, so much so that you're not given your location when looking at it. Really, it's more like an actual map, where you can see what landmarks there are and get an idea where your location is in relation to the landmarks. You have Kyoya, who is basically the main character of the game, kinda, sorta, not really.
You?
I have a name. Kyoya.
Thanks, Kyoya.
Don't catch you slipping now.
You have Tamon Takeuchi, a college professor who likes to keep the company of his students, as you can see. She gotta get an A. He's a native to Hanuta, which you really don't realize until sometime into the game, but it's hardly a spoiler.
So, you...
I was born in this village. I was raised here until my parents were killed in an accident.
Don't catch you slipping now.
You have Shiro Miyata, who's a doctor because he has a white coat. He's actually kind of crazy, as you find out as you play the game.
It doesn't matter how you cut them up, they just regenerate. I can't do much about it now.
This is unrelated, but his name always made me think of the car.
Be a monster.
Don't catch you slipping now.
Akira. No, not that Akira from the movie Akira. This Akira, or Akira. He's a hunter and a native of Hanuta, but also a bit of a hermit that doesn't really interact with the other locals.
I'm going to get out of here before I turn into a monster as well.
Don't catch you slipping now.
And this, man, I kinda hate this bitch.
This sucks. I want a shower. Oh, where is everyone?
This is Naoko Miyama, and she is a prissy model that, as soon as the player sees her, can't help but make a judgment on her clear vanity. As a matter of fact, her desire to maintain her beauty through her youth is something that actually becomes quite apparent a fair amount into the story, but I'll leave it at that in the mindset for trying to prevent spoilers.
Wait, how do I...
Do you want to be like that? Do you want to live forever?
This is Mrs. Dakota.
Mrs. Dakota! Help!
She's a teacher from the school and is often with another character, Harumi Yamoda. Reiko Takato had lost her child prior to the events of the game, to the unfortunate event of her 2-year-old daughter drowning during a trip to the beach, and in turn, she projects a strong maternal disposition towards Harumi. And what I mean by this is that it actually comes off as a little selfish. She only wants to take care of Harumi, even offering to be her mother, only for her own solace and comfort, not Harumi's.
So, she's your secret sister. How about if I be your mother? Megumi.
There's also Kei Makino, a priest for the Mana religion, the cult of Hanuta. He's Shiro Miyata's twin brother, whom he was separated from at birth. Despite the fact that he's a part of the failed ritual that actually sends the events of the game to begin, he's still among the survivors trying to survive and evade the Shibito. Risa Onda is also another character that left Hanuta for bigger and better things, but family, namely her twin sister, had her reconsider after some time, leading her to return to the village. Okay, so I'll try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. So again, the game begins with Kyoya having a flat with his bike during the day and wanders off into the woods. He comes across an NPC in the game, Miyako Kijiro, smashing something on the ground. She hears him and runs off. Kyoya ends up being in the same spot later that same night where a ritual for the cult is taking place. I think he left at some point during the day and goes back later that night to get his bike, and that's why he happens to be able to watch the ritual. As he watches from afar, he sees the same girl behind a veil and she notices her. Another member of the ritual, Jun Kijiro, Miyako's brother, as he mentions at the beginning of a stage not too much later after this,
It looks like you've been taking good care of my sister.
takes notice of Miyako's distraction and calls out to Kyoya's presence in the woods. Kyoya, being frightened over his presence being ascertained, runs off into the woods. He runs, gets a flash of red as if seeing himself from an outside perspective, and is confronted by an officer who takes shots at him. Now, the most important thing to realize is just that the fact that the ritual was interrupted is basically what sets the game's events into motion. And this is the second time this has happened within the confines of the game's history. This game takes place in 2003 as to where the previous failed ritual took place in 1973 and affected a handful of some of the characters you play as. That's the story in a nutshell. Basically, after this is the process of trying to overcome the game's missions as all the various characters, and by doing so, uncover a little bit more about the overall lore of the game and why things are the way they are. It's very, air quotes, Silent Hill in that regard. That's to say, again air quotes, this is just how things are. The initial motivation of the characters are to just escape Hanuta and all the horror within. But that does change as the characters begin to understand a little bit more of what's involved with the red water, the Shibito, the handful of very Wesker-esque NPCs that you come across.
You still have more to do. You know that we can't proceed without you.
So the focal point does change eventually to stopping the events that are taking place within Hanuta that's causing the villagers to turn into Shibito, as well as this hive mind type of behavior that does indicate an agenda the antagonists have. There are quite a few characters, but given the horrors and dangers within Hanuta, believe it or not everyone is safe. There are some main characters that will die, and upon death, do convert into Shibito. Some change to Shibito brains, and others just regular Shibito. But for me, this is a harrowing thought, just knowing that at one point I would take control of a character, and through my efforts as a player, was to keep them alive, and yet despite this, it would all be for naught, as they would eventually die regardless. Actually, I guess that does make a good segue into how I feel about the game's horror as a whole. This game, despite its age, visuals, controls, and probably most of all, me having played it before, this game is still scary. I still get nervous when playing it, and that's something that I think won't expire because the way this game prioritizes its difficulty in tandem with its goals and horror. I mentioned this at the beginning of my Silent Hill review, that American horror often, but not always, relies on shock value, and on the flip side, Japanese horror relies on psychological horror. Japanese horror and American horror tend to be very different. Japanese horror always tends to be more psychological and relies on getting in your head. Between the two, the North American approach relies much more on shock value as opposed to thought-provoking scenarios, which in my opinion is much better in an interactive media like gaming because a lot of horror is subjective to the player's perspective. If it was just jump scares, then it would get formulaic. Jump scares in essence really don't work more than one time. For example,
It's the same shit. The same shit.
really wasn't nearly as scary the second time. Silent Hill gets in your head to the point of you wondering what's really there or not. Even in recent memory, Resident Evil 2 the remake is almost a remarkable example of how the horror is implemented, except for its one major flaw. RE2 is incredibly scary the first time you play, but not so much every subsequent time, no matter how much one would wish it was.
Jesus, stay back!
Mr. X stomping around the PD is so scary and nerve-wracking the first time you play it feels overwhelming, but that's what you want from a scary game. Sadly, potentially the most scary element of the game doesn't have a lasting impact. I'm not saying that RE2 isn't fun after the first time, I'm just saying that after the first playthrough it isn't nearly as scary, which for a lot of people is part of the fun, a part of the thrill. Siren somehow, someway, manages to transcend all that. Let me be clear, it's not perfect, but goddamned if it's not the closest to a game that can be consistently scary no matter how many times you play it. Like I mentioned before, the game is very dependent on using stealth and the sight jack mechanic. If you have no weapon, then it's easy to understand why you would get uneasy for fear of getting found, because then you die. You have a melee weapon, maybe less likely on a stage and mission that you're already familiar with to have the same type of fear. However, a stage like that incorporates Shibito with firearms is again making you the lowest common denominator, the bottom of the food chain. So again, not fighting other melee Shibito, but the fight itself having the potential to alert an armed Shibito is what networks itself through a stage when faced with each and every foe. So, say you have a gun, but then you're able to run out of bullets, and there's a handful of stages that deliberately leave you with the minimum amount of ammo in order to remind you that you are still the weakest link. On top of that, every shot you make will alert a Shibito in the area a fair distance from you. So when it comes to combat, it's a facet that can make an individual in any horror game potentially feel empowered enough to no longer feel the fear. Although this does have some bearing on Siren as well, it is however much less prominent overall. So not just the combat is considered in Siren's formula for fear, but also objectives. Oftentimes you have to get from one end of the stage to the other in order to make progress in the game. Sometimes it's as easy as just traversing the stage, other times there's hoops to jump through. For example, there's one stage that you play as Naoko, and like I've mentioned, you have to escape the level. But to do this involves a little more elements of play. You have to explore the stage for a key to get into a custodian shack that's on the far side of the stage, opposite of where you start off. You find the key in one of the mine shafts that you'd have to brave before making your way to the custodian shack. After that, you'd make it to the shack and find a revolver, which is needed for you to unlock subsequent stages, seeing as how the game is dependent on you piecing together a chronological timeline. Also, to be shooting the Shibito that's there in the area, something you couldn't do until you got the gun, drops a key required for being able to execute the stage's second mission objective. You then return and sound the alarm in the Siren Shack, attracting all the Shibito to the main area, including the one that blocks your path to escape in one of the tunnels. You have to do this to lead him out of the tunnel, as this is because if you were to confront him straight on, he would just shoot and kill you before you had any chance to retaliate, as this is the game's intention. This amount of work to pass a stage is commonplace in Siren, which makes this fear factor so ever present. With every single step you take to completing a stage, you have all the risks involved to failing by getting killed and starting over at the beginning of the stage. You always run the risk of getting caught at any point in your game. But Derek, why would that make it scary every time you play? Nothing is definitive. Nothing is certain. Anything and everything can change on a dime. The obtuse amount of probability is what makes the game scary, because despite what you know and what you've done, you still won't know what can potentially happen next. If you're to get discovered and are being pursued, it doesn't automatically mean you're gonna die. If you get hit, you could manage to escape. Or if you get shot, you can still manage to get away. If every encounter meant death, then the game wouldn't be scary. It would probably be more annoying than anything. If you got spotted, you'd probably just throw up your controller and say, "Yup, I'm dead," with a scowl on your face. The lack of knowing, but not the lack of trying, is the major contributor to why this game is so scary. On top of that, there's so much to risk if you do get killed, which can change from one playthrough to the next on a single stage. Now again, I'm not saying that it's perfect. There will be many times that you can be playing on a stage where you'll probably be dying in the same spot back to back to back to the point of frustration. But that moment you actually do manage to get past that point, it's absolutely unreal how the tension and anxiety can shoot through the roof. In most other games, you'd feel relieved when passing a point in the game that was getting you killed over and over. But in Siren, it can actually reignite and amplify the feeling of fear and dread. The game's atmosphere is incredible. The game can be daunting at night, sure, but I'm impressed with how unsettling the game can still manage to be during the day. In most outside areas, it's almost always incredibly foggy to the point of impairing your vision to maybe only 10 feet, more or less in front of you, and this is regardless of day or night. Flashlights can help with exploring stages at night or just dark stages in general, such as ones that take place mostly indoors. But of course, given the nature of the game, turning on your flashlight does run the risk of getting you spotted by enemies. The music is also really well done. It definitely fits the tone of what the game is trying to go for. have parts of the game where it's raining, which is always indicative of dire straits like the ones in the game, of course. You know, in zombie games, there's always this fall of civilization look they kind of go for. You can tell that some shit really went down. But in games like these, such as Siren or Silent Hill, it looks more like an abandoned town, like people just up and left. To me, that really speaks volumes for setting a type of mood it's going for, something of a more ominous and supernatural type of vibe. A little bit more on gameplay. Siren mirrors a lot of traits from Silent Hill or even earlier Resident Evil titles. You can examine a whole bunch of stuff by pushing X to interact with it. A lot of these things are just for show and world building, like one would come to expect if they're no stranger to these types of games. But you do things like this because you can never be too sure if you'll interact with something you need or not. Now, the game isn't that terribly cryptic. When you're in the immediate area of some sort of miscellaneous item that's intended for you to pick up, the perspective of the camera will change, and usually said item becomes the focal point, making it easier for you to spot as you pass by. Although, in rare instances, there are still times where you may need to search for certain critical items where the camera doesn't change positions, and this can make finding something specific more challenging. You'll often have to bring up a context-sensitive menu with triangle throughout the game's entirety. This menu is what you need to do actions, such as lock doors, pick up items, call your NPCs that you escort, or direct them into hiding, and numerous other things. I could go on, but all in all, that's all there really is to say for it as far as the gameplay. That goes for the majority of the game, really, as far as the interface and interaction with said things throughout the stages. Everything it offers is actually really on the lean side, but is still all in all everything you need to make the most of your experience. I really like this game. Definitely a game that I can bring up about horror games that isn't Resident Evil or Silent Hill. But I like to be objective, and when you have to bring up the potential problems with the game, well, in my case, it makes me worried because, especially these days, I feel like you can't mention certain problems without scaring some people off. The same type of people that may very well have enjoyed the game if they gave it a chance instead of ran off at the first sign of trouble. So there's a give and take with some of these issues. For one, the game is potentially very long, and I mean very long. In a couple days, I'm going to get started on the next video, and hopefully I have my video out for Halloween, for the Halloween special.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
If you really want to see every level there is to see and actually see the quote-unquote true ending, it's going to take quite a bit of work. Now, no spoilers, but again, like I mentioned, the game's progression is based on a timeline that tends to hop around a lot as you play and open access to other stages as well as replay previous stages in order to progress. There's a point in the game, fairly later on admittedly, but still not the end, where you get the actual ending cutscene that takes place after the 3-day period. Now, this might come as a surprise to have to say this, but there's a boss in this game. I say this because of how the game plays and the structure and so on, that there's a point where when you're playing, you may actually think that there's no boss at all. And to my experience, that's what people usually think after having begun a playthrough, only to have been surprised that there actually is a boss. Now, to actually be able to get to where you confront this boss does involve having to do most, but not all, second missions in the game. In order to do this, you're going to have to invest quite a lot of time into the game to figure out how to unlock and subsequently complete these second missions on any given stage. Now, on the one hand, when a player is given so much to investigate and so much lore and mysteries from the characters in the game to piece together, it could be very alluring and all the more gratifying when you accomplish completing these all on your own. On the other hand, though, given how much time the game asks from you to do these things, it can wear you down if you have a goal in mind. Say, for instance, I don't know, maybe to make a review that you want out on Halloween, but you start running out of time? Look, I make every effort to beat games on my own, but sometimes when it comes to beating a game for a review, I gotta take the low road and look up a walkthrough. And despite having had played this game before, approximately, albeit 15 years ago at the time of the making of this video, in the interest of trying to finish this video in a reasonable amount of time, I did just that. But here's where Siren can really test you. I think for any person that watches this video can agree, Whether you've played this game or not, this game is very under the radar, and that has even affected online resources when it comes to actually trying to figure out certain puzzles or mission requirements to progress in the game. One such example is doing the second mission for Reiko Takato on day 1 at 23:45 or midnight essentially. You have to light the lanterns in a specific order and also help Harumi escape. Basically a whole second step on top of the first mission objective. Not really a big deal though, and there's a fair amount of stages with missions that do this. You have 4 lanterns in the stage labeled A, B, C, and D, and you can see each respective location via the in-game map. But they aren't to be lit in alphabetical order, but rather in an order that's to be determined by what you see on the lanterns themselves. Honestly, even now, I can't remember what the order is off the top of my head, so basically, process of elimination. And I bet you thought that that was the tough part, right? Wrong! You see, everything I just mentioned can be found in a walkthrough. Here's the thing though. In order to light these lanterns, you have to have the candles from another stage to do that. And if you happen to know a better one than I do, please leave it in the comments, because the few walkthroughs that actually are out there assume you already have the candles to begin with. A lot of the challenge could come from starting a second mission and not even having the correct items in order to do the mission. If you didn't know this in advance, this can waste a lot of time, and again, the walkthroughs don't help with stuff like this. Most people would probably just assume that you'd find the candles in this stage if you looked hard enough. It's not very often, but it does happen enough times to frustrate some people, I'm sure, where you can start a second mission, try your best to figure it out, perhaps even solve some things in the second mission that you couldn't in the first, and believe you're well on your way to actually finishing the second mission objective to come to a screeching halt because you don't know what to do next, only to at some point realize that you need to quit the stage and go somewhere else to possibly pick up or find what you need for said mission. The problem is the game doesn't tell you when times like these are. Again, Reiko Takato's stage to light the lanterns doesn't tell you that you need candles to do so and that you have to get them in another stage. So, you go to another stage. The stage for Takato previous to this one is the first one that you play her as in the timeline whilst escorting Harumi. The stage where they're in the school. The candles are found only if you hide Harumi in one of the cupboards at school, but you wouldn't know which one. Even at that, if you had her hide in a cupboard, you wouldn't even have known that she had the candles until after you reached the checkpoint for that mission, having reached the faculty room. And even more so, not even until then, but until after you picked up a key in the faculty room for the gymnasium in order to find a crowbar to be able to pry away the boards, to escape through the window. There's a lot involved to do. All for a maybe. You'd have to play almost half the stage in order to know if you actually got the candles or not. It's not a very long stage compared to others, but there's a lot of room for error, especially since you have to protect Harumi, and after you knock out the boss Shibito, the school principal, Harumi will be in a random spot hiding in the school, so there's also even a little RNG. Here's another thing, and this goes for every item, every weapon, every archive. If you go back to a previous stage to get something you need, whether it's an item to use for a puzzle in a different stage or just an archive, let alone doing it on your first playthrough, if you die, you no longer have said item or what have you in your inventory. I feel like this is probably more so an issue on revisiting stages, as that's typically why you do so in the first place. But here's really what dials that home is, like I previously mentioned, there are checkpoints, which is great because some of the stages can be very long, and taking it from the top every time you die is a great way to have people just want to quit. However, say you find something as mentioned before you get a checkpoint. Then you reach the checkpoint, but die at some point after. You will start over from the checkpoint, but you will no longer have said item, and again, a lot of the reason one returns to earlier stages is to do exactly this. So basically, for all intents and purposes, you essentially gotta have a perfect run. Only until you beat a stage will you actually retain whatever you acquired during your play of the level in question, so long as you didn't die. I don't think I need to explain why this can be a problem. That being said though, I didn't feel like it was that much of a problem outside the fact that I did have the personal goal of finishing this game much faster than the last time I had played. If you're familiar with Majora's Mask, and all the more like Majora's Mask, then this may potentially be minor inconvenience. But objectively speaking, it does make the game longer all in all.
So, since I'm usually Mr. Spoiler, I figured it'd be best for me to talk about the game's development cycle as opposed to the game's story for a change. Maybe that'll keep everybody off my ass for once.
So the creative mind behind Forbidden Siren is Keiichiro Toyama, whose team worked on the Gravity Rush games after Siren Blood Curse, the last installment of the Siren franchise. At the time of this recording anyways, which actually went on to be fairly successful. But more notably, was the founder of Team Silent, the dev team that created Silent Hill. As one could tell, you could draw a lot of comparisons from the horror and gameplay elements alike in both horror games. Although it needs saying that Toyama only worked on the first Silent Hill game after Team Silent's conception and left Team Silent after the first game's release. A couple other devs also left with him to join SCE Japan Studio, currently known as SIE Japan Studio, and worked on Forbidden Siren with their division being named Project Siren. On a side note, however, the dev team currently actually goes by Team Gravity, although based on my research, it does seem that the names are interchangeable as opposed to being changed. The most unique aspect of this game's development is how motion capture and facial animation was implemented. Actors that would play the characters in the game would be recorded at 8 different angles in order to remap all their facial animations onto the character models to give the game more realism. Although the tech used is fairly dated by today's standards, the game's presentation, I feel, holds up very well and hasn't aged much in contrast to just the graphics and such. It's very easy to interpret what the characters are trying to get across to players, and the bulk of that is done by the facial animations of these actors. It's crazy to think how much was involved with this type of early face capture. It's basically the bridging of full motion video and in-game visuals to make the realism seamless. Even with how old this game is, it's a pioneer for this type of approach for characters in a video game. Only recently has this type of approach been a lot more common.
Take all my food too while you're at it.
By the looks of it, you could lose some of that food.
Listen to me, you little shit.
No, fuck you! You handcuffed me!
I need you to shut up.
Games that come to mind are Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice and Death Stranding off the top of my head. Some people would probably do a callback to L.A. Noire, but Forbidden Siren did it first, and even then, L.A. Noire was too much in the vast minority of this type of technical implementation of facial animations for the time. Despite the team's ambitions with the tech they used and approach to gameplay, the game was met with pretty average reviews.
It's a strong 7.
But an overall decent reception. Nothing groundbreaking, but the game did get a cult following, and all in all, it did have 2 more installments in the franchise. Forbidden Siren 2, a direct sequel on PS2, and Siren Blood Curse, a reimagining of the first game on the PS3. These do have their caveats, however, as Siren 2 was only released in Japan and PAL regions with no release in the US, and getting a PAL copy to work on an NTSC PS2, even if it's modded, is kind of a nightmare. For the sake of letting you all know, I did manage to get it to work on my Modbo 4.0 PS2 Slim, although despite many failed attempts prior, I don't know what I did different to get it to work in the end, but it can in fact be played on a modded PS2 Slim, this I could say for a fact. As for Blood Curse, it was originally released in episodes, although I wasn't aware of the game's existence until sometime in 2011, after it actually already had gotten a physical release, which included all the episodes for a full game experience. On top of that, as of June 2016, Siren has been made available digitally for PS4. It's been upscaled and now has trophy support, which is pretty cool, so that's something that the everyman can use to play the game if they so choose without having to use an actual PS2 and PS2 copy of the game.
Siren is a great horror game. It's a game that can stay scary after all these years, and believe me, I don't scare easy with games. It's not an easy game though, but don't let that scare you off. There's a lot of game to be had here. Just know that if you're in for the long haul, it'll take your time your first run through. My 2 cents is just know that getting all the archives just to unlock the last cutscene in the Link Navigator, it's definitely not worth it. It even makes less sense overall when you see it. So much so that despite being spoiler free, I actually already played the cutscene at some point during this review, and you wouldn't even know the difference even after playing the game extensively. So play the game is all I have to say. It won't be a waste of time. Shit.